The US GDP growth was revised up, and I think that's pretty important to talk about because we've had a lot of bad economic news recently, so really it's high time we had some good news. Here are the details. The US economy grew 3% in the second quarter, faster than initially thought. The US economy grew faster in the second quarter of 2024 than first reported, suggesting there was little sign of a slowdown through the first 6 months of the year, that's January through July. The latest reading of the gross domestic product, GDP, published by the Commerce Department came in at 3%, up from an initial estimate of 2.8%. The change was driven by personal spending, which advanced 2.9% compared with the prior estimate of 2.3%. GDP is the single largest measure of economic activity, capturing consumption, investment, government spending, and trade. And those who are curious about what specifically the GDP measures, GDP stands for gross domestic product, which is the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country in a single year. And once again, thanks to this reading, we can see that the GDP is now the highest it has ever been. We can zoom in on the last, 5-ish, 6-ish years. Geez, 2017 was 7 years ago. Oh my gosh. But we can see basically quarter to quarter, it is continuing to go up. And not only is it currently the highest it has ever been with the latest reading, putting it at around $28.5 trillion, it's also the largest in the world. This is Wikipedia, a list of countries by GDP. We come down to the list, and there the United States is at around $28 trillion. It just depends on which estimation you go by. Here we are at the top, and then there's China about 10 trillion lower than us, and then Germany about 14 trillion lower than them. And I'm emphasizing this because it's important not to be trapped by the doom and gloom headlines that we see constantly, because that's what get the most clicks and sells the most advertising dollars. So of course companies like NBC, CNBC, Fox News, what have you, are going to err on the side of bad headlines, even when things seem to be going pretty well. It is important to cover bad news when it's relevant, but it's also important to try not to get sucked into a cycle of only looking at bad headlines and not actually understanding what's really going on, or locking yourself into a bad mentality when things could be improving. And speaking of things improving, it's not just the GDP that's been doing better than initially suggested, it's also average people, as you can see here. The typical US worker out-earned inflation by $1,400 a year, data shows. In the tug of war between paychecks and prices, the typical American worker has come out on top. While higher costs for everything from milk to medicines have preoccupied US consumers in the pandemic era, earnings have also risen enough, on average, and that's a very important part, to push up households' purchasing power a bit. And blue-collar workers have seen the biggest beneficiaries. An analysis published in July by economists at the Treasury Department found that the median worker can afford the same representative basket of goods and services that they did in 2019, plus an additional $1,400 per year. And to be clear, $1,400 a year is actually not that much. It's like $115, $116 a month extra. But it's better than it was in 2021, when inflation was absolutely destroying the average person's paycheck. It was at like 9.6% or 9.1%, and nobody could keep up with it. Every quarter, the amount of money you had was worth less and less. Even if you were getting a pay raise, you were still losing out overall. And it's important to talk about these little wins. I mean, GDP went up, that's great. Wages have kept up with inflation in the last year, and that's great. Inflation itself is cooling, and that's great to see as well. You can see here it says inflation rate falls to 2.9% in July, adding to signs that surging prices have abated. Consumer price growth in July has slowed to its lowest post-pandemic level, a sign that the surging inflations that have gripped the US economy are finally ebbing. On a 12-month basis, the CPI cooled 2.9%, down from 3% in June, the first time the index has dipped below 3% since March of 2021. Month over month, it rose 0.2% after falling 0.1% in June, and then it talks about the latest readings. So that's yet another good sign that we should be happy to see. Now, I know you're probably thinking about some other news you've heard recently that isn't so great, like unemployment. Isn't that at 4.3%, or the highest it's been recently? And the answer is yes, but that's not all bad news either. Here is the unemployment graph. Probably what you are thinking about is this 4.3% number right here. But if we think about this, this isn't as terrible as it might initially seem. To understand this, we have to see the definition of unemployment. It is the unemployment rate represents the number of unemployed people as a percentage of the labor force. And the labor force is the sum of people employed and unemployed. But in this metric of unemployment, only people that are actively looking for a job are counted. And the labor force is counted as people who are either currently have a job or are actively looking for a job. So if you don't have a job, but you're also not looking for a job, you're not counted in either of those numbers. So if more people feel generally good about the economy, so they start looking for jobs again after a long time away off of savings or being homeless, then that's actually a good thing. Unemployment would go up because there are more people actively looking for jobs, but this would actually be a good thing because, like I said, there are more people looking for jobs, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. This is the labor force participation rate. This is the percentage of the eligible to work population that is actually working. And as you can see here, it has been on a bit of a decline since the mid 2000s, but if we jump here to the last few years, you can see that since the pandemic, it's actually on an upward trend. And it's risen from basically 60% to about 62.7%. And that's pretty good to see. And additionally, the unemployment rate climbing is probably a pretty good thing for Fed rate cuts. Most likely in September, thanks to the unemployment rate going up and the inflation coming down, we're going to see those cuts, probably 0.25%, but it could be as much as 0.5%. And that's kind of good for everyone because people will start to be able to afford housing again. Now, because the world is complicated, I understand that there's basically never always just good news or just bad news. There's some nuance. And in this case, this good news does have a bit of an asterisk. See, GDP is basically all the money that was spent and earned, and it doesn't measure whether people went into debt to actually spend that money. And this is where we get the small catch. Here we have consumer loans, credit cards, and other revolving plans from all commercial banks. And as you can see here, since, let's just say mid-2018, the amount of debt that the US consumer is holding is basically the highest it has ever been. People are spending to the tune of $1.064 trillion, money that they simply do not have. And this graph actually doesn't do the real number justice. The real number is much higher than that. And that's because buy now, pay later is not counted in this unless the debt goes into default. So companies like Affirm or Afterpay or whatever Apple's version of that is, where you pay for a large purchase in increments of like $25 a month for the next 6 months, that's not counted as consumer debt unless you default on that debt and you're unable to make the payment. So the real number is actually a lot higher than this. And this is called ghost debt, which is debt that is definitely out there but is not counted by commercial banks because the companies do not report it to the commercial banks or the credit bureaus. And CNBC actually talks about this, where it says, oh my, why buy now, pay later debt could become a problem for the US economy. And we can come down here to the specific section where it says buy now, pay later companies generally do not report information to the major credit bureaus, which means they typically do not reflect in people's credit scores, which means that if it's not reported, we don't actually know how much money out there is in this buy now, pay later debt. I can't imagine it's much, much higher. It could be a few billion more because of how popular they are, but this is ghost or phantom debt that we do have to consider is not being counted. And there's your asterisks. The amount of money that people are spending is going up, and that's fueling an economy that's recovering really well from the pandemic. But as a result of that, a lot of people are going into debt. So we'll just have to see if this debt is a bubble that pops or if this debt is just the cost of one of the healthiest economies in the world right now. It's good to get out of a cycle of bad news, including a lot of the news I report here on this channel. So please remember that things on average are slowly getting better, and we have to take some hope in that. Thanks for watching.